I was only introduced to Resident Evil fairly recently in 2020, and while I loved the franchise, it wasn't until this year that I became head over heels obsessed with it. After replaying the Remake Trilogy, what I now consider to be my pinnacle of Resident Evil, I have been infected with a desire to play and study all things Resident Evil. So with that in mind, I thought it would be good to make a video sharing my enthusiasm with you all. That being said, I do still have a specific goal today. So in today's video, I'm not just going to be talking about why I love Resident Evil, I'm also going to be talking about what I think future games can learn from my favorite games in the series, the Remake Trilogy.
Stars and Stripes!
Hello and welcome to another Carrot Scraps video, and by another I mean the 126th. Now in today's video I want to do a couple of things, but I wanted to give a couple of disclaimers up front. First of all, what I'll be doing today primarily is talking about why I like the Resident Evil Remake Trilogy. That's Resident Evil 1 Remake from 2002, and then Resident Evil Remake 2 and 3 from 2019 and 2020. I will also occasionally be talking about what I call the Resident Evil Action Trilogy, which is Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. And in context to those 6 games, I'll be talking about what I want from Resident Evil games in the future. And with that, I want to make a couple of things very clear. First of all, and most importantly, just because I express that I like something about Resident Evil or horror games, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that you are wrong for liking something else. I'm just talking about what I like about Resident Evil games and what I would like to see from future Resident Evil games. And that's based on my preferences. And I hope that you find my thoughts interesting, whether you agree with me or not. And to be very clear, even though I love the Resident Evil Remake Trilogy, I still haven't played Resident Evil 1 through 3. And I might occasionally mention those 3 games and the design philosophy behind them, but I want to make it clear again that I haven't played them. One last thing I wanted to mention before we get into the video is something about work. As you know, I work for Juniper Technologies, and they've been sending me a lot of stuff since I've started working for the company. And I gotta be honest, recently, I kind of let some of my responsibilities slip, and I had a package delivered that I didn't attend to immediately. And basically, I mean, I don't know what to say about this. I brought this package in, and I don't know. It looks like something got out.
Let's start things off by talking about the Resident Evil games that I like the most. At this point, I've replayed the first Resident Evil remake multiple times. After my first time playing it, I knew I loved the game and immediately replayed it after. I made a video on the channel about the game, and it's even become somewhat of a tradition for me to replay it every October. It's crazy how much I like this game and how many different reasons I find it so amazing. For example, I think the fixed camera angles are perfect and they're super unique. Sometimes I feel like I'm walking through a painting, which isn't really a feeling that I've had while playing a video game before. It's something that I didn't like in a game like Devil May Cry, but I think is perfect for a game like Resident Evil Remake. I think the music is unsettling yet melodic in a way that gets under your skin and stuck in your head. Music is really important to me in general, but especially in horror, and especially in horror video games. I mentioned recently that I wish there were more melodic tunes in Scorn, and it's because of stuff like Resident Evil Remake. Because when you're alone exploring this mansion, sometimes having this unsettling music keeping you company can be extra creepy. I also think the graphics are timeless in Remake, which is part of the reason why it's so easy to pick up the game 20 years after its release. Most importantly, I think the puzzles are enthralling, but also extremely immersive. It's weird, but the way that puzzles are presented in this game make me feel like I'm actually in the mansion. So overall, all of those details are things I admire about Resident Evil Remake, but when you mix them all together, it makes one of, if not my favorite horror video games ever made. And a game that really hooked me on the franchise from day one. Now, I enjoyed Resident Evil Remake 2 and 3 back in 2020, but I think there's a possibility that I was a little overwhelmed by everything else I was doing that month, and so it distracted me from how much I liked it during that first playthrough. I had just finished Resident Evil Remake for the first time, and I think it's possible that my enjoyment for that game overshadowed the other 2 remakes. Because while I remember liking these 2 games a lot, I didn't feel that strong desire to replay them the same way I did the first remake. I also think it's possible that because I was trying so hard to play as many Resident Evil games as possible that month, that rush kind of overshadowed my enjoyment as well. Lastly, I really didn't like Resident Evil 4 when I first played it, and so that also could have killed my enthusiasm for the previous 2 games I had played. After playing Resident Evil 7 and 8 for the first time, and after doing my annual replay of Resident Evil Remake, I randomly felt the urge to replay Remake 2 and 3, and to my shock, I did not just enjoy these games, I became absolutely obsessed with them. And after completing 2 and 3, I just replayed them again. Now, while I miss the fixed camera angles from that first remake, I can't deny it is delightful having full control over my camera in Remake 2 and 3. So I wouldn't call it better, just different and still really good. The atmosphere is fantastic in Resident Evil Remake 2, especially with the option to have the original music thanks to DLC. I also really love the dark areas in this game, and I like the way that your flashlight lights every room. There's something very real about the lighting mechanics in this game. In addition, I feel like nothing is lost in terms of puzzle solving when playing the original remake versus 2. While I probably still prefer the puzzles in the first Resident Evil remake, I also really love the puzzles in Remake 2. We also get what I consider to be my first pursuer enemy in the form of Mr. X, and I'm not just in love with his design, that static Michael Myers-esque face, but I also love his relentless stalking of the main character, and I really love his inclusion in the game. In addition to just loving the core game, I feel as if there's a ton of content to play. While I know B scenarios aren't as fleshed out as they were in the originals, you essentially get 4 different versions of the campaign that you get to play as Claire or Leon, and then both of their B scenarios. In addition, you also have Hunk's campaign plus some short bonus campaigns. The main campaign was honestly enough for me, but the fact that there's so much to do really is the icing on the top. And so Resident Evil 2 Remake is a phenomenal game to me, and the only reason I don't crown it as my favorite Resident Evil game is because I still really love that first game. But that being said, even though this game was made almost 20 years after the first remake, I think it perfectly carries on the things that I loved in Remake 1 into the sequel remake. And even though it isn't a perfect remake of the original game, it really is one of my favorite Resident Evil games and one of my favorite horror games. Now, Resident Evil Remake 1 and 2 might not share many fans. I've found that if one person loves one game, they typically don't love the other, but I don't think there's a shortage of Resident Evil fans who love either. I think to this day, Resident Evil Remake 1 and 2 are hailed as 2 of the best games in the entire franchise. But moving on to a more controversial opinion of mine, I love Resident Evil Remake 3 as well. Now, to be completely clear with my thoughts, I enjoy both Remake 2 and 3 tremendously. But when I say I love Resident Evil Remake 2, I also think it's one of the best Resident Evil games in the franchise. On the other hand, while Resident Evil 3 Remake might be one of my personal favorites in the franchise, I don't necessarily think it's one of the best games in the series. At this point, I've played RE3R many times, and I can definitely recognize its flaws, but those flaws don't stop me from loving the game. I'm a huge fan of Jill Valentine, and I think one of the biggest compliments I can give to this game is how well they handled her character. I really love Jill's presentation in this game, and it's one of the main reasons I return so frequently. In fact, it was really nice to see her in this remake because it's been disappointing not to see her in the franchise in general in many recent Resident Evil games. Even though I wish we got more environments, I love the way the city looks, and I love the puzzle areas in the game. I also wish we had more Nemesis as a pursuer enemy, but I also really love the way that he's done in this game and enjoy his bizarre transformations. I also do appreciate the increased focus on action. It doesn't feel like Resident Evil 4 or 8, where survival horror is essentially traded off for action horror, but it feels like it's balancing the two worlds very well. Not perfectly balanced, but a balance that I enjoy nonetheless. So if we do get more action-oriented Resident Evil games in the future, I would like to see them handled similarly to this game, where puzzle solving and action horror are juggled pretty well. I just wish we had more than what we were given when it comes to Resident Evil 3 Remake. There's so much I love about this game, and with a little bit more fleshing out, I feel it could have been one of the best games in the series. This game has a number of shortcomings on its own, but especially when you compare it to the things that were edited out from the original game to the remake. There are so many details and areas from the original game that I think would have been tremendously implemented in this new remake, and it's so disappointing as someone who didn't play that game to find out how much was cut. Generally speaking, as a Resident Evil game, I love it, but as a remake, it leaves a lot to be desired. In general, I just wish we had gotten more in the Resident Evil 3 Remake. There's so much I love about this game, but it's so short, and I think with a little bit more fleshing out, it could have been one of the best Resident Evil games in the series. Now, juxtaposed with all of that praise for the Remake Trilogy, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the Action Trilogy, specifically Resident Evil 4. Now, when I first started playing Resident Evil 4, I knew what I was getting in for. I was already aware that the gameplay was going to be drastically, or at least somewhat different, and I knew that while I loved the Remake Trilogy, that I was probably not going to be the biggest fan of Resident Evil 4. So when I tell you I went in with an open mind, I hope you know that that's the case. And yet still, I really disliked playing Resident Evil 4. Presumably presumably because it strayed so far from those details that I admired about the first 3 remakes. In fact, I had so much trouble getting the enthusiasm to play it that it took me 2 years to finish the game. And after that, it caused me to skip 5 and 6 because I didn't want to play games that were similar to that gameplay style. The main reasons why I didn't like Resident Evil 4 were essentially the changes to gameplay and the changes to atmosphere. I did think that a lot of the environments were beautiful and pretty creepy, but in general, I felt the game was meant to feel more like a silly action movie. And while there were some puzzles in the game, I didn't feel they were as compelling as the puzzles from the Remake Trilogy. In addition, while I absolutely love Leon as a protagonist, I felt like there was a severe lack of lore in the game, which was something that kept me playing the previous 3 titles. In general, it felt like the main focus was on combat scenarios. And like I said, I don't necessarily mind a focus on action in a Resident Evil title. I just personally don't think that it was done very well in this particular entry. In fact, when I eventually did play Resident Evil 6, I actually enjoyed that game much more as an action horror video game. Now, to be completely fair to Resident Evil 4, after I finished the action trilogy, I've had an urge to replay that game. I want to give it a second shot and see if I was just being a little bit too harsh when I first played it. But even though I have that want to return, it doesn't change the fact that I still wasn't the biggest fan of it when I was playing. And it wasn't like I mildly disliked this game, it was genuinely hard for me to finish it. But again, that being said, I also wanted to mention that even though I have this opinion of the game, it doesn't take away the historical relevance to video game history that this game has. For an example, I'm also not a big fan of Mario 64 or Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, but I could never deny the significance of those games on the video game industry, and video game design in general. So when it comes to discussions about oh my goodness. Did you hear that? I could have sworn there was like a scurrying, I think it came from the You know, I don't think I'm going to be able to talk much about this box in this video. I just feel like I'm not going to get the time to encompass. It's strange, it's weird, and I'm just not going to get the time to talk about it in this video. But believe me, it's a weird there's a creature in my house, and it came from that box, and it's covered in purple goo, and I don't think I'm going to be able to talk about it in this video, and that's very, very upsetting, disappointing to me. But yeah, Resident Evil 4. I think what I was trying to say about that game was... So now that I've had the opportunity to talk about the things that I love about the Resident Evil Remake Trilogy, let's talk about how these details that stood out to me could be used in the future for suggestions in the franchise. Let's talk about how those details that stood out to me can be used to make better Resident Evil games in the future. First of all, something consistent that I liked about all 3 remake titles is atmosphere. In the first Resident Evil remake, fixed camera angles weren't just carried over from the original title, they were drastically altered to make the game more creepy. And when it comes to Resident Evil Remake 2 and 3, lighting was an important tool used to unsettle the player, and to keep them walking on eggshells. Because after all, anything could be hiding in the dark. I know this might seem like obvious advice to give to a horror game like Resident Evil, but I've played Resident Evil titles at this point where this is not the main focus of the game. So whether it's lighting, fixed camera angles, or something new, I think that atmosphere needs to be focused on, especially when it comes to making new and great Resident Evil games. Now, potentially tied for the most important detail that I think should be carried over into newer Resident Evil titles is puzzle solving. In my opinion, puzzle solving is inseparable from Resident Evil's identity. Speaking personally, part of the reason why I like these games is because of the presence of these puzzles, in addition to what they add to the experience. I think they're thought-provoking, I think they add to the suspense, and to me, they're the main source of gameplay. The way I see it, guns are used to protect yourself long enough to solve each of these puzzles. And when you're taking your time trying to figure out solutions, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable spot to be attacked by monsters, and that only adds to the tension of the game. Now the thing is, puzzle solving is something that is missing from some Resident Evil games, and in other Resident Evil titles, puzzles might be present, but I don't think that they're implemented super well. So moving forward, I think a stronger focus on that style of gameplay would tremendously improve each new title. Something else to keep in mind for the future of Resident Evil is that if a new title pursues an action horror game over a survival horror game, I would hope that it still preserves preserves the puzzle-solving identity of the older games, because I'm not against action-oriented Resident Evil games, but I would like those entries to mesh better with the rest of the franchise, particularly from a gameplay perspective. I think lore is one of the most interesting parts of a Resident Evil game for most players, including myself. However, there are some Resident Evil games that I think get a little too detailed. I think part of the fun of the original games is finding notes scattered across various locations, and trying to piece together a narrative that you weren't supposed to see in the first place. Understanding the story of a Resident Evil game should feel like its own puzzle. I think this is something that the Remake Trilogy represents very well, and I think this is something that could really improve future Resident Evil titles. Something else I appreciate about Remake 2 and 3 is the focus on Resident Evil characters. The Resident Evil franchise has a plethora of fan-favorite characters, but for whatever reason, over the years, we haven't seen as many of them as often as I'd like. For example, in canon, we haven't seen Jill Valentine since Resident Evil 5. That was back in 2009, so seeing her in the Resident Evil 3 remake, especially depicted so well, was really refreshing. And while I do think that there are some Resident Evil titles that focus on the characters a little bit too much, I would still like to see these characters more frequently. And I think a game like Resident Evil 2 Remake is a good example of how often you can show your characters without overshadowing the horror. Lastly, I think that music was a common point of consideration from me in the Remake Trilogy. The original Resident Evil Remake reimagined iconic Resident Evil songs, but also added something new and otherworldly to each track. One of the few big problems that I have with the second Resident Evil Remake is the amount of music in the game. Most of the game is silent, and the new tracks are rarely heard. I think this was a huge mistake, and while it can be creepy sometimes, I think it hurts the experience overall. This is why being able to use the music from the original Resident Evil 2 with DLC is the preferred way to play for me. Even though some people might consider those tracks somewhat dated, I think it makes the game way creepier. Resident Evil 3 Remake learned from the mistakes of 2 and included more music than its predecessor. Although I would have loved the original music DLC for this game as well, I love the new music too. So in general, my point is that music is super important in the Resident Evil series. It's a very helpful tool to put players on edge, and a great way to keep players entertained while they get lost in the process of solving a puzzle. And while many Resident Evil titles do have extensive soundtracks, I want to emphasize a focus on soundtracks that fit the franchise. I don't just want music, I want pervasive music that demands the player's attention without distracting from the horror of the game. I want songs that sound so weird that you can't forget them. Good music in a Resident Evil game should transport me to another dimension, so I'd love to see more of a focus on that in the future. So in general, I'm sure you've noticed that these 3 points and the other details that I've brought up are somewhat applicable to a recent Resident Evil title, or a somewhat recent one anyway. And yes, I would agree that Resident Evil 7 does a fantastic job of adhering to this list of suggestions that I have. The atmosphere is tense, we see the return of older style puzzles, and there are even some truly iconic musical tracks. While it's not a perfect game, I do adore playing it for exactly those reasons. In addition to Resident Evil 7, we are living in somewhat of a Resident Evil renaissance. Obviously, you've noticed that many of the games that I've praised in this video have come out in the last 4 to 5 years. And even though I might have some problems with games like Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 3 Remake, I still overall think they're great games. So again, I'm sure you're curious why I would feel the need to make a video like this if recent Resident Evil games have been pretty good. And it's simple, I just wanted to point out what I like about Resident Evil games, and I think a lot of these games exemplify that. And unfortunately, I know that in many franchises, especially Resident Evil, these qualities won't last forever. So I hope that this good track record that started with Resident Evil 7 and peaked with Resident Evil 2 Remake continues in the future, because so far it's giving me some of my favorite Resident Evil games in the series. And I hope you got something from listening to me explain why I liked these games. Now before we go for today, I wanted to mention something that I'm really passionate about really quickly. Are you a fan of horror? Well, if so, you should check out Fangoria magazine, a trusted name in horror since 1979, and still running strong to this day, and for good reason. Each issue of Fangoria magazine brings you closer to the world of horror by covering upcoming projects and revered classics. From simple recommendations to full-blown behind-the-scenes interviews with the people who bring these nightmares to life. After I saw the recently released film Smile, the first thing I did was crack open my October issue of Fangoria to see if they covered the movie at all, and if there was an article that I could sink my fangs into. I really loved this article in particular because it gave me valuable insight into the undertones and subtext that the director and actors were going for when making the movie. And that's just one example of many articles that I loved in the October issue. With each new issue of Fangoria, a window is opened into the world of terror for readers to peer into. So if that sounds interesting to you at all, make sure to check out Fangoria magazine and use code carrotscraps to get 20% off your purchase. I genuinely adore this magazine and I can't wait to introduce it to more people, plus using my code is a great way to support my content. So check out Fangoria magazine today and let me know what you think after. If you know about anything dripping in purple, or if you could help me, I'd really appreciate it. Leave any advice in the comments below, I guess. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I want to thank you so much for watching. If for some reason you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and to subscribe to my channel for more. As regular viewers know, I make a variety of content on my channel, and I'm always going to make the videos that I want to make. But if you see something you enjoy, make sure to let me know, and I'll try to prioritize that kind of content in the future. On Twitch, we often play superhero games like Marvel's Avengers or Gotham Knights, or horror games like Resident Evil. But this month, it is the Carrot Scraps Winter Games, which means we'll occasionally be playing winter games like Miles Morales Spider-Man. So if any of that sounds interesting to you at all and you want to watch me play video games live, you can check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/carrotscraps. And all my other social media, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are at carrotscraps as well. So I want to thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. On the other hand, while Resident Evil 3 make did you guys hear that? 3 make? Oh boy, I bet I'm the first to come up with that one. I need to text Guinness. It's my friend Guinness. He likes to write down cool things that I say. Gotta let him know.